Before we begin today's presentation, here is a brief and unrelated word. Quite apart from today's subject, there is also a separate book series titled Psyop Christianity, written by Ron Allen Curtis Ratzlaff, under the pen name The Awakened Hybrid. It is its own, entirely different investigation. That work stands on its own. Across 7 volumes, it examines historical anomalies in the origins of Christianity and makes the evidence-driven case that the faith was shaped deliberately by the Roman Empire. If that separate subject interests you, the complete series is available now on Amazon. Simply search Psyop Christianity or scan the code on screen. Now, let us begin. Episode 5. From Ararat to Avalon. A chronological reconstruction of Syro-Anatolian presence in prehistoric and ancient Britain through multi-proxy analysis. Part 5. Synthesis and Interpretation. Section 5.1. The cumulative weight of evidence. The evidence assembled in this investigation, drawn from archaeogenetics, linguistics, epigraphy, numismatics, and archaeology, presents a cumulative case for sustained connectivity between the Syro-Phoenician world and the British Isles, extending across multiple millennia. No single line of evidence is decisive in isolation, but the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence on a consistent pattern of contact and population movement argues against the interpretation of these phenomena as coincidental or insignificant. The genetic evidence provides the foundation for this argument. The presence of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry components in British populations predating the Roman conquest. The documentation of specifically Syro-Phoenician genetic profiles in Roman period Britain and the persistence of these components into the post-Roman period all indicate that population movements connecting the Eastern Mediterranean with Britain were not limited to the well-documented Roman period, but extended across a much longer time frame. The specific genetic lineages that show distributions linking the Armenian highlands and the Syro-Phoenician littoral with the British Isles provide genetic markers for these population movements that complement the evidence from autosomal DNA. The linguistic evidence, while more contested, provides additional support for long-term connectivity. The structural features of the insular Celtic languages that show affinities with Afro-Asiatic languages, the presence of specific lexical items with possible Semitic etymologies, and the adoption of Phoenician-derived writing systems by Celtic populations all suggest that linguistic contact between the Celtic and Syro-Phoenician worlds was more extensive than conventional models allow. The specific question of Hurro-Urartian linguistic influence on Celtic remains speculative but deserves systematic investigation given the genetic and archaeological evidence for population movements connecting these regions. The epigraphic evidence provides the most direct documentation of Syro-Phoenician presence in Britain during the Roman period. The inscriptions recording Syrian soldiers, Palmyrene merchants, and Eastern Mediterranean religious cults in Britain demonstrate that the Syro-Phoenician diaspora extended to the northwestern frontier of the empire. The maintenance of Eastern Mediterranean languages, scripts, and religious traditions in the British context indicates that these diaspora communities retained their cultural identity over multiple generations. The numismatic and archaeological evidence provides the material correlates for these population connections. The adoption of Mediterranean coinage in pre-Roman Britain, the importation of Eastern Mediterranean goods throughout the Iron Age and Roman periods, and the presence of Syro-Phoenician material culture in British contexts all indicate sustained commercial and cultural exchange. The specific evidence for the tin trade, connecting the mineral resources of Cornwall with the metallurgical industries of the Eastern Mediterranean, provides an economic mechanism for these connections that operated across multiple periods. Section 5.2. The tin trade as a persistent vector. The extraction and distribution of tin from the mines of Cornwall represents one of the most significant but underappreciated factors in the long-term connectivity between the British Isles, Eastern Mediterranean. Tin was an essential strategic resource during the Bronze Age, required for the production of bronze, and remained economically significant throughout the Iron Age and Roman periods for the production of pewter and other alloys. The geographical restriction of tin deposits to a limited number of regions, including Cornwall, the Erzgebirge, the Taurus Mountains, and Central Asia, made control of tin sources and trade routes a matter of strategic importance for the major powers of the ancient world. The isotopic evidence for the movement of Cornish tin to the Eastern Mediterranean has accumulated significantly in recent years. The analysis of tin ingots from Bronze Age shipwrecks and the isotopic characterization of bronze artifacts from Near Eastern contexts have demonstrated that Cornish tin was reaching the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, presumably through the Atlantic and Mediterranean maritime networks that connected the mineral-rich regions of Western Europe with the major centers of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenician role in the tin trade has been extensively discussed in the scholarly literature. The Phoenician cities of the Lebanese coast, lacking significant mineral resources of their own, were dependent on maritime trade for access to the metals required for their metallurgical industries. The Phoenician expansion into the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic coasts of Iberia and North Africa was driven in significant part by the search for metal sources, including the tin of the Atlantic coasts. The classical sources, including Strabo and Pliny, explicitly associate the Phoenicians with the tin trade, though the reliability of these accounts remains debated. The possibility that the tin trade provided a persistent vector for population movement and cultural transmission between the Syro-Phoenician world and the British Isles deserves serious consideration. The establishment of trading relationships between Phoenician merchants and British populations would have created opportunities for intermarriage, cultural exchange, and the establishment of diaspora communities in the tin-producing regions. The presence of Eastern Mediterranean genetic markers in British populations, the adoption of Mediterranean cultural practices and technologies, and the transmission of linguistic and religious elements could all be understood as the cumulative result of sustained commercial contact centered on the tin trade. Section 5.3. The Hurro-Urartian Legacy and its transmission. The specific question of Hurro-Urartian influence on the populations and cultures of the British Isles requires careful consideration of the mechanisms of transmission and the nature of the evidence. The Hurro-Urartian world was centered on the Armenian highlands and the upper Euphrates, regions far removed from the British Isles, and direct contact between Hurro-Urartian populations and British populations during the Bronze Age is unlikely. However, the evidence for Hurro-Urartian influence on the Syro-Phoenician world and for the subsequent transmission of Syro-Phoenician cultural elements to the British Isles provides a plausible indirect pathway for the diffusion of Hurro-Urartian cultural and genetic elements to Britain. The Hurro-Urartian influence on the Syro-Phoenician world is well documented. The Phoenician cities of the Lebanese coast were in sustained contact with the Hurrian and Urartian kingdoms throughout the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE through trade, diplomacy, and military conflict. The transmission of Hurrian mythological motifs to the Greek world, documented through the parallels between the Kumabi cycle and the theogony of Hesiod, indicates that Hurrian cultural elements were being transmitted through Syro, Phoenician, and Anatolian intermediaries to the Aegean and potentially beyond. The genetic evidence for Hurro-Urartian population elements in the Syro-Phoenician world has been illuminated by recent ancient DNA studies. The analysis of genomes from Phoenician sites in the Levant and the Western Mediterranean has revealed genetic components that derive from the populations of the Armenian highlands and the upper Euphrates, indicating gene flow from the Hurro-Urartian region into the Syro-Phoenician population. The subsequent dispersal of Syro-Phoenician populations through maritime trade and imperial deportations would have carried these Hurro-Urartian genetic elements into the broader Mediterranean world and, potentially, to the British Isles. The specific genetic markers that may indicate Hurro-Urartian ancestry in British populations require further investigation. Certain Y chromosome haplogroups that reach high frequencies in the Armenian highlands and the surrounding regions are present at low but persistent frequencies in the British Isles. While some of this presence can be attributed to Roman period movements and later historical migrations, the possibility that some proportion derives from earlier pre-Roman contact through Syro-Phoenician intermediaries deserves systematic investigation through the analysis of ancient DNA from British contexts predating the Roman conquest. Section 5.4. The Anu question revisited. The convergence of the Vedic ethnonym Anu and the Mesopotamian Hurrian theonym Anu, discussed in the opening sections of this investigation, requires reassessment in light of the evidence for long-term connectivity between the Indo-Iranian world, the Syro-Phoenician world, and the British Isles. The traditional dismissal of this convergence as coincidental homophony may need to be reconsidered in the context of the growing evidence for sustained contact and population movement across the regions in question. The mechanism for the transmission of the name Anu between the Mesopotamian and Indo-Iranian worlds has been discussed extensively in the scholarly literature. The Mitanni kingdom, with its Indo-Aryan elite ruling over a Hurrian population, provides a plausible context for the transmission of Hurrian and Mesopotamian religious concepts to the Indo-Aryan world. The presence of the deity Anu in the Hurrian pantheon and the prominence of Anu in the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy would have made this theonym available to the Indo-Aryan speakers of the Mitanni elite, who could have transmitted it to the broader Indo-Aryan tradition. The appearance of the Anus as a tribal grouping in the Rig Veda and their association with other tribes in the Battle of the Ten Kings provides additional context for understanding the transmission and transformation of this name. The possibility that these names were carried into the Celtic world and preserved in the mythological and onomastic traditions of the insular Celts deserves serious scholarly investigation. The presence of deities with names reminiscent of the Mesopotamian pantheon in Celtic and British mythology raises the possibility of a deep connection running through multiple cultural and linguistic traditions. The transformation of divine names and their attributes across cultural boundaries is a well-documented phenomenon in religious history, particularly in the context of the transmission of deities between different cultural and linguistic groups. The possibility that names and concepts originating in the Mesopotamian world were transmitted through Indo-Iranian and Celtic intermediaries to the British Isles represents a tantalizing possibility for future research. Section 5.5. Toward an integrated model, the evidence assembled in this investigation suggests the need for an integrated model of long-term connectivity linking the upper Euphrates cultural complex with the British Isles across multiple millennia. This model would recognize the operation of multiple vectors of contact and transmission, commercial, military, religious, and demographic, that collectively produce the patterns of genetic, linguistic, and cultural connection documented in the preceding sections. The commercial vector centered on the extraction and distribution of tin and other strategic minerals, provided the economic foundation for sustained contact between the mineral-rich regions of the Atlantic world and the metallurgical industries of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenician maritime expansion and the subsequent development of Syro-Phoenician trading networks across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic created the infrastructure for this contact and facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people between the Eastern Mediterranean and the British Isles. The military vector, manifested in the Assyrian policy of mass deportation and the subsequent deployment of Eastern Mediterranean auxiliary units in the Roman army, provided a mechanism for the movement of Syro-Phoenician populations to distant regions of the empire, including Britain. The presence of Syrian soldiers, Palmyrene merchants, and other Eastern Mediterranean personnel in Roman Britain is directly documented in the epigraphic record, and the genetic evidence suggests that these movements had demographic consequences that extended beyond the immediate presence of the individuals involved. The religious vector, reflected in the transmission of Eastern Mediterranean cults and mythological motifs to the Celtic world, provided a mechanism for the transmission of intangible cultural elements that are more difficult to trace through material evidence alone. The the parallels between ancient, Near Eastern, and Greek mythology, the presence of Eastern Mediterranean deities in the Romano-British religious landscape, and the possible echoes of Near Eastern mythological themes in Celtic tradition all suggest that religious ideas and practices were transmitted along the same networks that carried goods and people. The demographic vector, documented through the genetic evidence for Eastern Mediterranean ancestry in British populations across multiple periods, represents the cumulative result of the other vectors operating over extended time periods. The presence of Syro-Phoenician genetic markers in British populations, predating the Roman conquest and persisting into the post-Roman period, indicates that the movement of people between the Eastern Mediterranean and the British Isles was not limited to a single historical episode, but represented an ongoing process of contact and admixture. Part Z. Conclusions. The investigation presented in this study has traced the evidence for Syro-Phoenician and, more broadly, Upper Euphrates cultural and demographic influence on the British Isles from the Bronze Age through the early medieval period. The chronological framework adopted in this analysis has revealed a pattern of intensifying contact, punctuated by periods of apparent disruption that correlate with known geopolitical transformations in the intervening regions. The cumulative weight of the genetic, linguistic, epigraphic, numismatic, and archaeological evidence supports the conclusion that the British Isles were integrated into the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world to a far greater extent and over a far longer period than conventional models have acknowledged. The specific question of Hurro-Urartian origins and their relationship to the populations of the British Isles remains speculative but deserves serious scholarly attention. The evidence for Hurro-Urartian influence on the Syro-Phoenician world, for the transmission of Syro-Phoenician cultural and demographic elements to the British Isles, and for the persistence of these elements across multiple periods, provides a plausible framework for understanding how populations originating in the Armenian highlands and the upper Euphrates could have contributed to the genetic and cultural landscape of the British Isles. The history of the ancient world, as it has been traditionally written, has too often treated the major civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean as isolated entities, connected only by the dramatic episodes of conquest and colonization that dominate the historical record. The evidence assembled in this investigation suggests a different picture, a world of persistent, multifaceted connectivity in which populations, ideas, and cultural practices moved through complex networks that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single civilization. The British Isles, far from being a remote periphery at the edge of the known world, were integrated into these networks from an early period, and the legacy of that integration is visible in the genetic, linguistic, and cultural heritage of the British people to the present day. This concludes this series. This presentation was produced by Creatic Media, a veteran-owned digital studio. We build production-grade progressive web apps and custom software. Our own trivia platform, Muse Ion Trivia, shows exactly what we can deliver for your business. We also offer fully built business websites and ready-to-launch templates, from done-for-you sites to affordable starter designs. We also create marketing commercials using localized on-premise AI, giving small businesses broadcast quality ads for a fraction of the cost of a full marketing team. And because everything runs on our own hardware, your project never touches a remote data center. Your data stays private. Visit creaticmedia.com to start your project today. That concludes episode 5 and the From Ararat to Avalon series. Thank you for watching.